Judges on the state level in Oregon are elected because Oregon has a very strong populist tradition on the theory that, look, we want district attorneys elected. I was in China a year ago on an exchange with Chinese prosecutors because they have a constitution that they haven't obeyed essentially for 40 years, and now that basically economic freedom is driving them to a place where they need to follow the rule of law. And the rule of law is a huge deal. In America, we're used to it. I mean, the idea is, well, the law's on my side. You know, it doesn't matter. My landlord has more money than I do, but he can't do that to me because the law says he can't. Or my employer can't do that to me. Or the police can't do that to me. That's what rule of law means. And it took me a long time to understand. I think it's chiseled over one of the major buildings in Washington. A rule of law, not a rule of men. And that means a lot. That means it's not the person who's holding the power at the moment isn't the person who, I mean, there was just we remodeled the courthouse, and I urge all of you to come watch a trial. I mean, that's, in many ways, a lot of democracy in action. It's very messy, but the idea in a democracy is that we trust essentially the overall wisdom of the people, whether that's in the miniature in terms of a jury trial, that we say we're going to let 12 people decide whether the person's guilty or innocent, whether it's electing the judge or the district attorney, whether it's electing the President of the United States or our representatives. But the idea of the separation of powers is absolutely, is all important. If you let any one part of the government get more powerful than it should, and Oregon is a populous state. We have the power of recall, which a lot of elected officials don't like. It doesn't exist everywhere. But the theory is, if the elected officials are not doing... I have my job because the woman 14 years before me was recalled from office for darn good reason, as it turned out. I have to stand for office every 4 years. If I'm not doing the kind of job that people think I should be doing, I get turned out of office. Judges the same way. County commissioners the same way. If people don't think that the state government, for example, is passing the kind of laws they want, you'll see referendum. You're going to see a whole bunch of them. Now, some people may be critical of them and say, oh, these are really unwise, but it is the right of the people, and this is absolutely a keystone in the Constitution, which is we are going to reserve certain rights. The right, for example, for the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, and the right of to some degree, to regulate, for example, firearms. The Second Amendment was recently interpreted as where the comma is really important. The right, the need for a free country to have a well-regulated militia, comma, therefore, well, the Supreme Court decided what that meant is you can keep a gun. You have a right, and the government can regulate because it says you can't keep a machine gun, and it may mean, but it cannot say flat out you cannot have a weapon. So the Second Amendment says we're going to give this much power, but not this much power. But all those things that are not specifically reserved for one part of the government are reserved to the people. And that's what a small d democracy is all about. And although it can be very messy, I don't know if any of you, I watch Question Hour on C-SPAN. Question Hour is what it's in the British government every week. This Prime Minister of England. It's incredible. You think, whether you're, I happen to be a Democrat, but if you take any recent Democratic or Republican president and think of whether they would be able to stand as Tony Blair, and to a lesser degree Gordon Brown, who's the current Prime Minister of England, would, and take questions like this. It's a marvelous thing to watch, and it makes me very jealous sometimes. Think, well, why can't we have that form of government? On the other hand, the government of England is formed by having that person is the leader of that party. There's no consensus. The people of England don't vote for Tony Blair. Tony Blair represents one particular small little district, about 50,000 people. Oh, actually, Tony Blair doesn't represent anything anymore. He's retired. But there is, I think, a wisdom in the Constitution that you see not just writ large in the federal Constitution, but also in the state and how it operates locally. I mean, I was at a county commission meeting last night. Very, very intense one, because a lot of people there believed that the county commission was not listening to them about LNG, whatever your opinion might be one way or the other. And that creates an interesting tension. What is the goal and responsibility of the elected representatives? And if the people don't like it, do they have the power to overturn that? And to what extent is that regulated by the court? So these are not, the reason I bring this up is these are not arcane concepts. These are ones that have very direct effect on every single thing that happens in your life and your community.
Okay. Well, I will reiterate, I think, a number of the points that you've all made. I appreciate the comments and perspectives. Thinking about what powers were to the people and the vigilance that you're talking about, the jury system, or attending council meetings, it almost speaks that we're talking something here about that somehow government seems more responsive at the state and local levels, and we're quite concerned now about what's happening at national levels, the distance of Congress from us. And I'll use an example. The current problem, really, we have a constitutional crisis, if you will, this week. And it's the tariff, the Troubled Assets Relief Act. As proposed by Secretary Paulson, is $700 billion package before Congress. He included in the bill submitted to Congress, for the banking committee right now, was that this should not be under review, judicial or executive or administrative review. So he wants to exempt his powers to administer the tariff, the Troubled Assets Relief Act, without any judicial or administrative review. So this, right away, the Congress is faced with a congressional problem. You know, you have this wrench thrown in the monkey works. There's no wonder they're wrestling how to deal with this. And can you imagine a $700 billion project with all the details you've got to wrap out? How do we establish equity? How is it fair? And then we come back to this idea we're talking about, the power served to the people. Well, where do we fit for this? It's a huge crisis. And so I just wanted to bring today that, you know, the Constitution is always relevant. It's always a changing document in how it's interpreted. It's not the same Constitution of 1787 as admirable as that document was, but we've always got to look at the context we're in. So this goes to the heart of the current controversies we see about judicial activism and really paradox between those who may advocate against judicial activism, neoconservative arguments, on the one hand, and at the same time they're advocating a unitary executive, as in Paulson's initiative of sort of harnessing the power around the power of the executive. So these contradictions speak of new paradoxes that we have to wrestle with, and we need our vigilance at all times that way. And so as a historian, you know, teaching history, it's interesting to me the problem of how do we teach the Constitution as history, and what are the approaches, and where are we now with it? And I was reflecting on that here, because it used to be in American history that the Constitution was a central piece of teaching. And when I first, the Constitution was emphatic. It was the Federalist Papers, and it was rich materials. But it has really become more of a specialty, and for a number of important reasons. We've turned to social history over the last 30 years for necessary reasons. You know, African American history, women's history. The civil rights movement really forced historians to look at what was taking place after the 60s. So a whole generation of historians flooded into those issues. And the Constitution kind of got de-emphasized. Other than Gordon Wood, who's now in his 70s, there really haven't been anyone I can think of in history that's called a constitutional historian like Gordon Wood. They've all been in social history. But I would advocate as a result of that, really, we've kind of had legal history, and Josh, you know how complex constitutional history is, and it's very technical, and it requires us, law school and many years of study. And it's its own field now. And so there's a great emphasis in constitutional history as being the field of law. And so over in history, it's kind of a nebulous terrain in some ways. And I think Gordon Wood's rather concerned with what's happening with it their way. Because also Gordon Wood wrestles with where social history is going. Well, I think some ways that this can, hopefully, social historians, constitutional scholars can come back together. And I should also mention briefly, political science has a tradition of looking at it from a political development perspective. And I would say this, in terms of method, constitutional scholars and political scientists tend to begin from the time of the Constitution on. The social historians will look at the formation of the Constitution as a particularly rich period. So the point of departure is there's a little separation there.